Welcome to Apache Mastery. Let's start where every solid mental model starts, with what Apache actually is. Strip away the mystique and you've got two things: a long-running Linux process called httpd and a folder of configuration at by etc. Apache 2. The process reads the folder on startup, and when a request comes in, it consults those rules to decide what to do. Today is pure observation. Once this picture clicks, every lesson after this is just teaching you what to put in that folder. So here's the map for the next 20 minutes. 4 ideas, all before we touch a single config file. First, httpd is just a process you can watch with systemctl and journalctl, Apache 2 on Debian, httpd on RHEL, same software. Second, etc. Apache 2 isn't one file. It's a tree of small files wired together with symlinks. Third, every request flows through 5 phases: receive, VOST, directory, handler, response, and that sequence tells you where each config setting actually applies. And fourth, a quick, honest answer to why Apache versus Nginx or Caddy. We'll take each one in turn. Let's start with the third idea, because it's the spine of everything else. When a request like curl to shop.com that's about arrives, Apache walks it through 5 phases in order: receive the bytes off the socket, match a virtual host by host header, match a directory or .htaccess by path, pick a handler, static file, PHP, proxy, and finally send the response and write the log. Each phase has its own config knobs, and each one maps to a later lesson: L09, L04, L05, 06, L07, 08, L10. So when something breaks, you don't grep the whole tree. You ask which phase failed, and that tells you where to look. Now let's ground that mental model in something you can actually touch. Apache, or httpd on Red Hat systems, Apache 2 on Debian, is just a long-running Linux daemon, which means every tool you already use for processes works on it. Systemctl status tells you if it's alive and shows the master plus its worker pool. Journalctl gives you the last few log lines, and systemctl reload rereads the config gracefully without dropping a single in-flight request. One rule from day one: always run Apache 2ctl config test before you reload, because a broken config means Apache won't come back up. Now the second half of the model, the tree. On Debian and Ubuntu, etc., Apache 2 isn't one giant file. It's a directory where apache2.conf is just the entry point that includes everything else. Notice the pattern: mods available, sites available, conf available, hold every installed option, while the matching-enabled folders are nothing but symlinks pointing at the active ones. That's why A2nmod, A2nsite, and A2dismod feel like magic. They're just creating or removing symlinks. The structure itself is the API, and once you see that, Apache stops being mysterious. Quick detour before we go deeper, because someone always asks, why Apache and not Nginx or that shiny new Caddy? Apache optimized for extensibility, per directory, DHtaccess overrides, a massive module ecosystem, and deep roots in WordPress, cPanel, and Plesk. Nginx traded that flexibility for raw event-driven throughput at the edge. Caddy traded it for automatic HTTPS and a clean modern config. None of them is wrong. They're just tuned for different jobs. You're learning Apache because it still owns the long tail of the web, and now you can defend that choice. Back to the main thread, let's ground that 5-phase model in something real. One curl to shop.com, and Apache leaves a trail across your file system. The access log records the receive, the VOST match picks shop.conf. The directory match pulls in, .htaccess, the handler serves the static file, and the response phase logs the byte count. And when something breaks, the split is clean. Access, .log tells you what was requested, error, .log tells you why it failed. Master that distinction and debugging stops being guesswork. Now you might be wondering why we've spent an entire lesson without touching a single config file, and that's deliberate. 3 reasons. First, the mental model is transferable. Once you see Apache as a process plus a tree plus a life cycle, Nginx and caddy fall into place because they share the same shape. Second, debugging flows directly from the phases. When the server dies at 3 a.m., you're not guessing, you're asking which phase failed. And third, that Debian-style split tree will meet next isn't bureaucracy, it's the operational interface giving you symlinks, small diffs, and a smaller blast radius when things go wrong. So here's your reconnaissance kit. Print this, tape it next to your monitor, run it every time you SSH into a server. Each command answers one question. Is Apache alive? Is the config valid? What modules are loaded? Which virtual hosts exist? What's breaking? What's the traffic? And what shape is the tree? None of these change anything. They only reveal. Spend 90 seconds here before touching a config, and you'll save hours chasing the wrong fix. Now let's put that kit to work with 3 short drills. And the rule today is observation only, no edits. First, confirm Apache is alive 3 different ways: systemctl, ps, and curl. Each angle triangulates the same fact, and any mismatch between them is itself a clue. Second, run tree on etc's Apache 2 and predict what's in each directory before you look. That's how the file tree stops being abstract. Third, tail the access log in one terminal while you curl from another, then trigger a 404 and watch it land in error. Log. 15 minutes, no config changes, and Apache stops being a black box. Before we close, 5 thinking errors worth naming out loud, because once you spot them in your own head, everything downstream gets easier. httpd.conf is not the entry point on Debian or Ubuntu. Apache2.conf is, and it includes a tree of other files. Restart drops live connections. Reload rereads config without dropping traffic, so reload by default. Apache isn't dead. It runs a huge slice of the web and often sits behind Nginx in production. Editing a file doesn't apply it. You always confidest, then reload. And error, log only catches runtime errors. If Apache won't start at all, the truth is in journalctl. And that's lesson 1. You now carry the mental model. HTTPD is a process, etc. Apache 2 is a tree. Every request flows through 5 phases, and Apache earns its place alongside Nginx and caddy. Next lesson, we stop observing and start doing. Apt install Apache 2, systemctl status, curl localhost, find the default page, and make our first deliberate config change. See you in lesson 2.